The words hit me like a punch to the face. They echoed in my mind, sharp and unforgiving, each syllable like a hammer driving nails into my heart. "You're a burden. I sold Dad's company. This house is mine now. Pack up and leave." My son, my only child, standing before me, his face void of any emotion, his words dripping with contempt. I froze. Time itself seemed to stop. His words, those cruel, heartless words, shattered the world I knew. How could this be happening? How had we gone from sitting at the dinner table laughing together to this moment of betrayal, where the very person I'd given everything to was now casting me aside like an old coat? For years I had worked alongside my husband to build everything we had. The company wasn't just a business, it was our life's work. My husband, a man with the kind of determination that few could match, had poured his soul into that company. And I, his wife, stood by him every step of the way. We sacrificed, we struggled, but we believed in what we were building. And then when my husband died, I thought our son would carry that legacy forward. I thought we had created something that would bind us together, something that would endure through generations. But I was wrong. "How could you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "How could you sell it without telling me, without asking me?" He didn't respond immediately. He stood there almost as if he were waiting for me to accept it, to understand. His eyes, once filled with the innocent hope of a child, now were cold and calculating. It was like looking at a stranger. The warmth I once felt for him, the connection I thought we shared, evaporated in that instant. "You're a burden, Mom," he said again, his words even colder. "The company's mine now. You've had your time. It's over." The sting of his words cut through me like a blade. I tried to breathe, but the air felt too thick, suffocating. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but the overwhelming sense of betrayal was paralyzing. My son, the child I had sacrificed everything for, had just thrown me away like I was nothing. For a brief moment, I thought I must have heard him wrong. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding, a moment of rash anger. But the more I looked at him, the more I saw the truth in his eyes. He meant it, every word. He had planned it all along. He had sold the company, our legacy, without so much as a second thought. I never stood a chance. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear my heart pounding, the blood rushing in my ears. My hands trembled at my sides as I struggled to process what had just happened. My whole life had been turned upside down, and it was all happening in front of me too quickly, too painfully. "You sold Dad's company," I repeated, more to myself than to him. The words tasted bitter on my tongue. "You didn't even give me a choice. You didn't even care what I thought." He didn't flinch. His gaze never wavered. "It was time," he said simply, almost like he was explaining something trivial. "You can't keep holding on to the past, Mom. The company was dragging us down. I made a decision. It's over." That's when I saw it, an emptiness in his eyes, a detachment. The man I had raised, the boy I had nurtured, had turned into someone else, someone unrecognizable. My chest tightened, and the words I wanted to say stuck in my throat. My heart shattered in pieces, and all I could do was stand there in disbelief, like a bystander in my own life. The house, our home, was no longer mine. The company, the thing that had kept us going after your father passed, was no longer a part of me. My thoughts raced. Where would I go now? What would I do? I had spent decades building this family, raising him, teaching him. I had given everything I had, and now here I was, cast out. I opened my mouth to speak, to beg him to ask why, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing left to say. He had made his decision, and that was it. His voice cut through the air once more, each word deliberate and final. "Good luck paying rent. From a nursing home." I don't know why those words stung more than the rest. Maybe it was the sheer cruelty of them. Maybe it was the implication that in his eyes I was already worthless, someone who had nothing left to offer. I couldn't understand it, couldn't wrap my mind around it. This wasn't the son I raised, the one I had dreamed of. This was a stranger, a cold, callous version of the boy who once held my hand for comfort. "Get out," he repeated, this time with finality. "Now." And just like that, it was over. I didn't argue. I couldn't. I couldn't fight him. How could I? What had happened to the love, the respect? Where had it all gone? I turned away and walked out, my heart heavy with grief, with betrayal. The hallway seemed endless as I made my way to the front door. My legs felt like lead, my body numb with shock. I couldn't believe this was happening. The life I had known was slipping through my fingers. As I stepped out of the house, the weight of the world settled on my shoulders. I had lost everything. My family, my home, my purpose. I stood on the front porch staring at the empty space ahead of me. The house that had once been filled with laughter, love, and memories now felt like a distant dream. I had no place to go, no one to turn to. As I walked away, my mind reeled. I had devoted my life to raising him, to giving him everything I had, and this was how it ended, in a cold, heartless dismissal. The pain was unbearable, but I knew that the worst part wasn't losing the company or the house, it was losing the son I had once loved so fiercely. The betrayal felt like a weight I would carry forever. I had never imagined that the greatest pain I would ever feel would come from the very person I had given everything to. The first night was the hardest. The cold room of the nursing home felt like a prison. I could feel the chill deep in my bones, but it wasn't just the cold air, it was the isolation. The sharp, jagged feeling of betrayal still stung, cutting deeper than I could have ever imagined. My son had thrown me out like an unwanted object, and now I was just another faceless resident in this sterile, cold institution. The pain didn't come from the physical discomfort, the loneliness of the room, or the bland meals that I was now forced to eat. No, the pain was from something far more unbearable, the complete and utter abandonment. There were no goodbyes, no kind words, no attempt to understand. He didn't even care enough to explain. My own son had left me here discarded without a second thought. I lay in bed, staring up at the sterile white ceiling. It was silent, too silent. No children's laughter, no voice calling for me to help with homework, no husband's gentle teasing, just emptiness. I hadn't felt so alone in years, not even when my husband passed away. At least then, I had a purpose, a role to play in the aftermath of grief. But now I was just a forgotten relic of a past life that no one cared about anymore. The first few days passed slowly, dragging on like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. Each morning I woke up in this unfamiliar place surrounded by strangers. The other elderly residents here had their own stories, their own pasts. They weren't my family. They didn't know me. No one cared about me. It wasn't just being alone, it was being completely invisible, like I had never mattered at all. I spent my days in a haze of numbness. The staff here would bring me my meals, but they were kind only in the way one is kind to a customer at a restaurant, not with genuine care. The other residents would nod in my direction occasionally, but none of them knew me. None of them had ever known the life I had led. And in those long, lonely hours, I couldn't stop thinking about the past, the house, the family dinners, the times we'd sit together in front of the fireplace, laughing at the silliest of things. How could everything be so easily erased? How could my own son turn his back on me like this? Every memory of him, his childhood, the way he clung to me when he was afraid, the look of pride in his eyes when he achieved something, was tainted now. How had that little boy become a man who could throw his mother away with such ease? Every night I would lay in my small, lonely bed and stare out the window looking for something, anything familiar. But the only thing that greeted me was darkness. The shadows of the trees outside the window stretched out like the fingers of time, reminding me of how far I had fallen. I kept asking myself why would he do this to me? Was I such a burden? Had all my sacrifices meant so little? I had given him everything, my time, my love, my energy. And now nothing I had done seemed to matter. Was this what he thought of me? A relic, a burden, a fading shadow? The person who had once been his world was now nothing to him. Days turned into weeks, and still no one came. No phone calls, no visits. No one asking how I was, no one to share my worries, my thoughts, my grief. My son had sold everything we had worked for. He had cast aside everything that had given my life meaning, all in the name of greed and convenience. His betrayal didn't just take away my company and my home, it took away my dignity, my identity, my family. I was no longer needed. I was just a ghost. A woman who once had a life, who had built something with her own two hands, but who now existed in the shadows of others' lives, forgotten. There was one moment, one memory that kept playing in my mind, like a haunting echo. I could still hear the sound of my son's voice, clear as day. Good luck paying rent, from a nursing home. It was a cruel joke. The words were so cold, so final, that they cut deeper than any insult. Not only had he sold the family business, not only had he stolen from me, but he had also ensured that I would never be able to regain anything. The nursing home, the very place he had put me, was the end of the line. It was where the discarded went. People who no longer had any purpose. And in that moment, I realized he had done this to punish me, to remind me that I was nothing. The more I thought about it, the more the hurt turned into anger. I had loved him. I had poured my heart into raising him, teaching him right from wrong, helping him build his life. And this is what I got in return. Was my love so easily erased I couldn't let it go? No matter how deeply he had cut, no matter how alone I felt, I knew something had to change. I couldn't just sit in this nursing home waiting for death to take me. I had given too much of my life, too much of my soul to be discarded like this. I was not finished. Not by a long shot. I would not allow this betrayal to be the last word. If he thought he could take everything from me, if he thought he could wipe away my legacy, he was wrong. I would rebuild. I would rise from the ashes of his cruelty and show everyone that I was far from done. And so in the silence of that room, I made a vow to myself. I would not let him win. I would find a way to get back what was mine, to reclaim what he had taken from me. I would show him that I still had power, that I still had worth, and I would do it without him. I didn't need him to survive. I just needed the strength to rise again. The next morning, I woke up with a fire in my belly. I was done with the tears, done with the self-pity. It was time to take control of my life again. Time to prove that even when you think you've lost everything, you can still stand tall. And I would start over. From nothing, yes, but nothing was better than living in the shadow of betrayal. And so as the days turned into weeks, I began to plan. I reached out to old friends, old colleagues, from the business people who remembered the days when we fought side by side. I would not be the woman my son thought I was. I was stronger than he realized, and I would not let his betrayal define me. As the first cracks of light began to break through the heavy curtains of my isolation, I felt the stirrings of hope once more. I was not done. I still had a future to build, and I would not be broken. The silence of the nursing home felt heavier as the days wore on. The emptiness was suffocating, but it also became a crucible, an unexpected place where my anger began to change, slowly turning into something more powerful. I couldn't keep drowning in sadness. I couldn't let my son's betrayal define me. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became. There was no way in hell I was going to let him think that he could destroy everything I had worked for, every sacrifice I had made. He had thought he could break me, but I realized something that hit me like a revelation: I wasn't broken. I had just been bent, and it was time for me to straighten myself out. I woke up that morning with a fire in my belly. No more wallowing, no more waiting for something or someone to come rescue me. I was done being the victim of my own life story. I had lived for everyone else, my husband, my son, and it was time I lived for myself. And as much as I hated to admit it, this nursing home was the catalyst I needed. It was time to fight back. I pulled myself out of bed, straightened my shoulders, and walked to the window. The sky was gray, but I saw a glimmer of light just on the horizon, as if the universe itself was urging me to rise. It was the first time in weeks I had felt any sense of clarity. Maybe it was the anger from the betrayal or the weight of all my sacrifices, but I knew one thing for sure: I would not let him or anyone dictate my worth. In the days that followed, I began to make plans. I wasn't sure how I would do it, but I knew I had to try. I started by reaching out to people from my past, the ones who remembered the strong, capable woman I had once been. I contacted old colleagues, people I had worked with when the company was thriving. I didn't have much to offer them at first, just my words, but I knew the connections were there. I started to rebuild a network, small at first, but it was a start. Every morning I would call someone new. Every afternoon I would meet with a former business partner or a long-lost acquaintance from the industry. It was exhausting, but the more I worked, the more I realized something: my confidence was slowly returning. I would look at myself in the mirror each day and remind myself that I had made something out of nothing before. Why couldn't I do it again? I also knew that this would take time, but time was something I had in abundance now. With my son and daughter-in-law out of the picture, with no one to answer to, I could finally do what I wanted without the fear of judgment. The anger at first was overwhelming, but over time it became a driving force, something I could use to fuel my comeback. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about showing everyone, including myself, that I was capable of rising above it all. By the end of the first month, I had set up a plan. I would start small, a consulting firm at first. I had decades of experience. I knew the ins and outs of business, and I knew the industry better than most. I would offer my expertise to businesses in need of restructuring or strategic planning. That was the beginning. I reached out to Mr. Thomas, the former partner who had worked closely with us when my husband was alive. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I knew he would remember me. When I told him about the idea, there was silence on the other end of the line. But then he spoke, his voice warm with familiarity, and agreed to meet. It was a slow start, but a start nonetheless. During those early days of rebuilding, I felt like a part of me was coming back. Each phone call, each meeting, every small victory, I could feel the fire of my past self rekindling. The same woman who had built a business with her husband, who had managed it with grace and strength, was still there. And I realized that I hadn't lost anything, I had just forgotten how strong I was. One of the most surprising things was how others began to respond to me. I had thought that being in this nursing home would mean I was invisible, forgotten, but the opposite happened. When people heard about my expertise, my reputation, and my network, they began reaching out to me. I wasn't just a former businesswoman. I was someone with a lifetime of knowledge, experience, and insight that people valued. I began receiving offers to consult with companies, to speak at small business gatherings. It was small at first, but it was enough to prove to me that I still had something to offer. And each step I took felt like I was taking a step closer to reclaiming what had been taken from me. I wasn't just building a business again, I was building my self-worth. I was building my confidence back up. I wasn't the same person anymore. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the loneliness, they had forged a new version of me. I was more than just a mother who had been thrown away. I was a woman who had found her strength again. And no matter what it took, I was going to prove that I could not only survive, I could thrive. By the third month, things were really starting to fall into place. My consulting business was taking off. I was getting more clients, and the more I worked, the more my confidence grew. I began networking with the right people, and my experience was opening doors that I thought had long been closed to me. I felt the tension in my chest begin to loosen. I wasn't just surviving in this nursing home anymore, I was living. But there was one thing that kept gnawing at me. My son. He hadn't reached out once, not once. It hurt, but it also fueled my determination. If he thought I was done, if he thought he had buried me, then I was about to show him just how wrong he was. I began to make plans to take back what was mine, starting with the company he had sold. I knew the law, and I knew the business world. I wasn't going to let this slide. My next step was clear. I needed to make things right. Not just for me, but for my husband's legacy and the family business he had built. By the fourth month, I was ready. I had gathered everything I needed, the legal documents, the evidence, and a team of lawyers I trusted. I was going to fight back. I wasn't going to sit quietly and watch my son destroy everything I had worked for, everything we had built together. It was time. I could feel it in my bones. The legal documents sat on my desk, heavy with the weight of the past and the future. The evidence was clear, irrefutable. It was no longer just about building a business. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. My company, my legacy, and most of all, my dignity. The anger that had burned inside me for months had reached a boiling point, but now it was no longer the anger of a victim. It was the resolve of a woman who had been wronged and was finally going to do something about it. The pain, the betrayal, had lit a fire in me, but now it was no longer just about vengeance. It was about justice, and nothing would stop me from getting it. I had worked tirelessly to put this plan together. I had contacted every lawyer, every expert, every former colleague who could help me. I wasn't just going to sit idly by while my son thought he had destroyed everything I held dear. If he wanted to break me, if he wanted to bury me in a nursing home, he was about to find out that I wasn't as fragile as he thought. The first step was to gather everything, every document, every piece of correspondence, every detail I could find. It wasn't just about showing that he had betrayed me by selling the company without my consent. It was about proving that he had manipulated me, that he had acted unlawfully, and that I was entitled to reclaim what he had taken from me. The more I delved into the paperwork, the clearer the picture became. He had acted recklessly. He hadn't just sold the company, he had taken it from me, using every legal loophole he could find to force me out. I knew what he had done, and now I had the proof. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized this wasn't just about business. It was personal. He had stolen my life, my legacy, my identity, and he had done it without a second thought. That made it more than just a financial transaction. It was a betrayal so deep, so cruel, that I knew I had to make him pay. With each passing day, I felt the weight of my decision. I wasn't just fighting for the company. I was fighting for myself, for my dignity, for the woman who had given everything to her family only to be cast aside like a broken toy. And this fight was just beginning. But as I sat there reviewing the documents, my mind drifted back to the beginning when we started the company. My husband and I had worked side by side building something from the ground up. It hadn't been easy, but we had done it together. And then we had raised our son, hoping that he would one day take the reins. We had believed in him, trusted him with everything we had. But somewhere along the way, he had turned into someone else, someone I no longer recognized, someone willing to sell everything we built just to have his own way. That thought burned me more than anything else. He had betrayed not just me, but the very family we had worked so hard to create. He had torn apart everything we had ever known, and I wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. The first time I walked into the courtroom, my hands were shaking. But I wasn't nervous. I was prepared. I had everything I needed. I was no longer the woman who had been abandoned and tossed aside. I was a woman who was about to take back what was hers. As I sat down with my lawyer, I looked across the table at my son's legal team. They had no idea what was coming. I knew they thought they could win. They thought they had all the power, all the leverage, but they hadn't counted on me, on my resilience, on my ability to fight back. When the judge called the court to order, I took a deep breath. It was time. This was my moment. The room was quiet, but I could feel the tension building, the weight of the decision that was about to unfold. I had prepared myself for this. I wasn't just here to win a legal case, I was here to win back my life. The trial began. My son's lawyer presented their case first. They spoke confidently, laid out their arguments with precision, but something in the way they spoke felt hollow to me. They kept talking about the sale, the legality of the transaction, the paperwork. They tried to paint me as an uninvolved passive figure in the entire process. It wasn't hard to see the story they were trying to tell the grieving widow who was too weak to understand the complexities of business. The sad old mother who didn't have a say in anything. But I wasn't that woman anymore. When it was my turn, I stood up slowly. My heart was pounding, but I wasn't afraid. I had been through so much. This was just another obstacle in the path I had walked for years, and I wasn't about to back down now. I began to speak, my voice steady, my words clear. I talked about the years I had spent building the company with my husband. I talked about the sacrifices we had made, the sleepless nights, the fights, the challenges, and the victories. I spoke about how my son had come to me asking for my support, for my guidance, only to turn around and betray me in the most devastating way imaginable. As I spoke, I saw the faces in the room change. The lawyers, the judge, they couldn't ignore what I was saying. This wasn't just a business dispute. This was a mother fighting for the family that had been stolen from her. This was a woman fighting for her dignity, and they could see that now. But my son, he just sat there, his face pale, his jaw clenched. He couldn't look at me. He couldn't meet my gaze, and for the first time in a long time I saw something in his eyes. It wasn't just guilt, it was fear. Fear of what was coming, fear of the truth I was laying bare. The court session lasted for hours, but every minute felt like a victory. I'd never felt so strong, so sure of myself. And by the time the session was over, I knew I had made my case. I knew that the truth was on my side. The next few days were a blur. I spent my nights preparing, reviewing every piece of evidence, every argument I had made. And then came the day of the final ruling. I could barely sit still, my heart racing in my chest. The room was filled with tension, and then the judge spoke. In the matter of the family business and the rights of the plaintiff, the court rules in favor of the mother, Mrs. Whitaker. The words hit me like a wave crashing over me. I felt a rush of relief, a surge of triumph that I hadn't expected. I had done it. I had won. As I left the courtroom, I could hear the murmurs of the lawyers, the sound of people moving around. But all I could hear was the beating of my own heart. I had taken back what was mine. When I finally saw my son again, he looked at me differently. There was no longer any arrogance in his eyes, no self-assurance. There was only a sense of loss, a loss he could never recover from. I had won, but it wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the company. It was about something far more important. I had reclaimed my dignity, and I had proven once and for all that I wasn't someone to be cast aside, and that I realized was the sweetest victory of all. The moment the court ruled in my favor, a wave of emotions crashed over me. For a split second, I felt a rush of relief so strong that it almost brought me to my knees. But then came the quiet that followed the sudden calm after the storm. I had won. I had taken back what was rightfully mine, but the victory didn't feel as sweet as I had imagined. As I stood in that courtroom listening to the judge's final words, I couldn't help but glance at my son. He looked completely defeated. There was no arrogance in his eyes now, no defiance. Instead, he was a broken man, his face pale, his body tense, and his eyes filled with regret. He had thought I was weak, that I had nothing left to give. But now here I stood, having won the fight that he had started with his betrayal. I didn't feel victorious in the way I had expected. I had imagined that after all this pain, after everything I had lost, there would be a sense of triumph, a moment where the anger and the hurt would finally dissolve into satisfaction. But that wasn't what happened. The victory didn't bring me happiness. It brought me peace, but it also made me realize just how much of myself I had given away in the process. As I left the courtroom, the weight of what had just transpired began to settle in. The victory wasn't about reclaiming the company or the assets. It wasn't about taking revenge. It was about something much deeper, about reclaiming my dignity, about proving to myself that I still had value, that I was more than just the role I had played in the lives of others. I spent the following days reflecting on everything that had happened. The pain, the betrayal, the loneliness, those were the things that had pushed me to my breaking point. But now, in the quiet of my own thoughts, I began to see something I hadn't seen before I had changed. I wasn't the same person who had walked into that courtroom weeks ago. I wasn't the same woman who had felt helpless, abandoned, and lost. I had fought for what I believed in, not because I wanted to destroy my son or to tear apart our family, but because I needed to regain my own sense of worth, and in doing so, I had rediscovered my strength. I wasn't just a mother, a wife, or a businesswoman. I was a person who could stand on my own, who could take control of my own future, and who could rise above the pain that had once threatened to destroy me. But as I sat in the quiet of my nursing home room, I realized that this was only the beginning. I had won the battle, but now I had to figure out how to rebuild my life, not just my business, but my entire existence. I had spent so many years focused on others, on my family, my son, my husband, that I had forgotten about myself. I had forgotten what it felt like to live for me, to take pride in my own accomplishments, to find joy in the simple things that made me feel alive. The victory had given me back my confidence, but now I needed to learn how to live with it. I needed to learn how to embrace this new version of myself, this woman who had been broken and rebuilt. I couldn't go back to the way things were, and I didn't want to. The life I had lived up until that point, of serving others, of putting everyone's needs before my own, had left me hollow. I had sacrificed so much, but now I understood that self-sacrifice wasn't the key to fulfillment. I needed to find a balance between caring for others and caring for myself. I began to fill my days with new routines. I no longer waited for someone to visit me or call me. I took charge of my own time, my own happiness. I enrolled in activities at the nursing home. I joined a book club, something I had never done before. I began to spend my afternoons painting something that brought me a sense of calm and satisfaction that I hadn't felt in years. These small changes brought me a sense of peace I hadn't realized I was missing. But the most significant shift came when I started to reconnect with people, not just out of obligation, but because I wanted to. I began to form new friendships, people who didn't know me as his mother or her wife, but simply as myself. For the first time in years, I was no longer defined by my relationships with others. I was simply me. It was in these moments that I realized how much of myself I had lost along the way. I had spent so many years being everything to everyone else that I had forgotten what it meant to simply be. I wasn't just a mother, a wife, or a victim of betrayal. I was a woman with her own desires, her own dreams, and her own right to happiness. As the weeks passed, my perspective on life began to shift. I started to feel a sense of fulfillment in the smallest of things. I would walk outside in the mornings, feeling the cool breeze on my face, and for the first time in a long while, I felt alive. The world seemed brighter, more colorful, and full of possibilities. I had been given a second chance, not just to rebuild my business, but to rebuild my life, to find a purpose that was mine and mine alone. I thought about my son often, but not in the way I had before. I no longer waited for him to come to me to apologize, to make things right. I had learned that my happiness couldn't depend on him or anyone else. I had been waiting for a long time for him to recognize the pain he had caused, for him to see that his actions had consequences. But now I understood that waiting for that acknowledgement wasn't going to change anything. I had to move forward with or without him. As I reflected on all that had happened, I realized that I had grown in ways I never could have imagined. The woman who had once been defined by her role in her family, the woman who had sacrificed everything for the people she loved, was no longer the same. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that she could not be whole if she didn't first take care of herself. And though the path to recovery had been long and filled with heartache, I had found something more valuable than anything else: my independence. I didn't need anyone's approval, not even my son's. I was enough. And that realization that I was enough was the greatest victory of all. But the journey wasn't over yet. It never truly would be. I would continue to rebuild. I would continue to live for myself with purpose, with strength, and with the knowledge that no matter what life threw my way, I had the power to rise again. As I sat in my room that evening, looking out at the setting sun, I smiled. I was free. Free from the past, free from the pain, and free to live life on my own terms. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of satisfaction, not because I had defeated anyone, but because I had finally learned how to live for myself. The courtroom had felt like a battlefield, and I had won. But as the weeks passed, I realized that the battle wasn't the end. It wasn't about winning the company back or proving my worth to my son. It was about something far deeper. It was about reclaiming myself, about finding peace within the wreckage of my past. I had spent so much of my life chasing approval, seeking validation, and sacrificing everything for others. In the end, that sacrifice had cost me more than I had ever realized. It had taken my identity, my sense of self, and it had left me hollow, dependent, and afraid of losing what little I had left. I had given away so much of myself, until there was almost nothing left but the pain of what I had lost. But that woman, the one who had been betrayed, forgotten, and cast aside, was no longer me. I had learned that lesson the hard way, and I would never make that mistake again. I had risen from the ashes, not because I had to prove anything to anyone else, but because I owed it to myself. I owed it to the woman I had once been, and to the woman I had become. The legal victory, though important, had only been the first step. I had fought to reclaim my family's business, to reclaim my place in the world. But what I hadn't expected was how that fight would change me. I wasn't just rebuilding a business, I was rebuilding my entire life. I had learned the most difficult lesson: that I had value, that I deserved to live for myself, and that I didn't need anyone's approval to feel whole. As I sat in my small room at the nursing home, looking out the window at the sun setting over the horizon, I reflected on everything that had brought me to this point. I no longer saw myself as a victim. I saw a woman who had overcome betrayal, pain, and abandonment. I had fought back not for revenge, but for my own survival, for my dignity, and for my future. And as I thought about it, I realized that this was the first time in my life that I had truly lived for myself. For the first time in years, I felt free. I had spent decades giving everything to my family, to my son, to my husband. But I had forgotten one very important thing: I had to give to myself too. It wasn't selfish. It was necessary. Because in order to love and care for others, I had to love and care for myself first. That realization in and of itself was a victory. It was the freedom I had been searching for my whole life. And as I sat there, I knew that this wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something new. A new chapter where I could make decisions for myself, where I could live without the weight of guilt, shame, or expectation bearing down on me. My son's betrayal had shattered me, yes, but it had also given me the strength to rebuild. And it had brought me to the realization that I could do things on my own. The years I had spent raising him, pouring my love and effort into his growth, had been valuable, though it had led to heartbreak. It had also helped me find the strength within myself. That was the irony of it all. I had spent so much time focusing on him, on the family, that I had neglected the most important person in my life, myself. But now I was free. Free from the past, free from the chains that had kept me tethered to a version of myself that no longer fit. I had shed the old skin of self-sacrifice, of self-doubt, and I was emerging as someone stronger, wiser, and more capable than I had ever been before. And while the betrayal still hurt deeply, it no longer defined me. I didn't need my son to validate my existence. I didn't need his approval, his apology, or even his presence in my life. I had learned that the only person whose approval I needed was my own. The life I had now was mine to shape. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the time I had left wasn't to be spent in regret or bitterness. It was to be spent in pursuit of the things that made me happy, the things that brought me joy and fulfillment. I had earned the right to live for me, and that thought filled me with a sense of peace I had never known before. The days that followed were a blur, but in the best way. I spent my time engaging with people, making new connections, finding joy in the simplest moments. I no longer dreaded the quiet of the nursing home. Instead, I embraced it as a place where I could reflect, grow, and create. I joined art classes, participated in activities, and found joy in the camaraderie of others who had lived long lives and had their own stories to tell. The more I opened myself up to the world around me, the more I realized how much life there was left to live. I had spent so much time focusing on the pain, on the loss, that I hadn't seen the possibilities that lay ahead. And then one day my son reached out. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a grand gesture, it was a simple message asking how I was doing. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had reached out. He had recognized in his own way that there was more to me than the role I had played in his life. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't need to. What mattered was that I had come to a place where I didn't need anything from him. His acknowledgement, his recognition was something I didn't expect and didn't require. The real healing had come from within me, and so I moved forward. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't fear it. I had learned that life was about more than the challenges it threw at you. It was about how you responded to those challenges. I had been knocked down, but I had gotten back up. And now I was walking into a new chapter 1 that I was creating for myself, where I could finally be free.